they put forth a tremendous effort and elicited a tremendous amount of evidence that's extremely powerful. So again, maybe it could have been configured differently, but under the circumstances, I think, with which the members were faced, they did a heck of a job.
Joe Moreno, former federal prosecutor, thanks so much for joining us. Joe Moreno there. Thank you for watching this special coverage on BBC News of the final public meeting of the January 6th committee investigating that attack on the US Capitol. I was there that day. It was brutal. The committee has now voted to criminally refer former President Donald Trump to the US Department of Justice, a vote without precedent. Thank you so much for watching BBC News.
Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. This is BBC News. There is breaking news in Washington, D.C. The committee investigating the Washington Capitol riot recommends bringing criminal charges against former President Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin's in Minsk for talks with President Lukashenko as fears grow that Belarus may be used to launch a new attack on Ukraine. A peace deal with nature is what the biggest UN biodiversity conference agreement in a decade is being called. It's offering protection to a third of nature on the globe. Nearly 60% of Twitter users have voted for the company's chief, Elon Musk, to step down from that role in a poll that he posted himself. And we'll keep looking at Argentina's spectacular World Cup victory. The team's heading home with the trophy after a 36-year wait. Well, let's begin with this developing story in Washington, D.C., where the final hearings have been taking place into the January the 6th riots. That's when a mob of protesters stormed the Capitol building to try and overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Within the last few minutes, the committee has voted unanimously to recommend criminal referrals of Donald Trump over the events of that day. Well, straight to Washington, our correspondent Nomia Iqbal is live with us. First things first, Nomia, help us understand what a criminal referral is. Nomia, thanks very much for taking us through it. Now, President Putin's been in Belarus for talks with his counterpart Alexander Lukashenko, they're close allies. There's been speculation that Putin may try and attack Kiev from Belarus, just like he did 10 months ago. And when Putin arrived in Minsk, he was greeted on the runway by President Lukashenko, as you can see. A spokesperson for Mr. Putin called suggestions that pressure was being put on Belarus to take part in the war in some way, called it stupid and groundless speculation. And this is what President Lukashenko had to say. Just watching that and suddenly thinking, there's no translation on that, so unless you speak Ukrainian, I can only apologise, and clearly that was only so helpful. We'll get some translation put on that for the next time we play it. On the other side of the border, Russian forces are claiming to have shot down 4 US-made missiles. The Defense Ministry said the missiles were intercepted over the Belgorod region of Russia. The regional governor there said one person was killed following shelling by Ukrainian forces, though we're not able to confirm that. Well, let's speak to Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, live with us from Washington, D.C. Melinda, thank you very much indeed for your time. What do you make of the fact that President Zelensky once more is pushing for greater help with air defence? That's really useful. Melinda, thank you very much indeed. Melinda Herrings from the Atlantic Council. Well, next let's bring you up to date on a major development for the world's environment, because after talks that extended late into the night, an agreement was reached aimed to protect the planet's ecosystems. First of all, here's the reaction from the World Wildlife Fund. Well, let's look at how critical, how pressing this situation is. One estimate published in 2019 warned that 1 million plant and animal species faced extinction within decades. To put that in context, that's a rate of loss 1,000 times greater than had been expected. So for some, this deal has come as a relief, but it's not without its criticisms. One conservation organisation described it as a mixed bag, saying that it fails to advance beyond the targets of 10 years ago in terms of addressing drivers of biodiversity loss. And here's more analysis from the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowland. Now, not for the first time, we've got to talk about Twitter and Elon Musk. Mr. Musk launched a Twitter poll asking if he should resign and appoint a different CEO of Twitter. 57% of people who voted in this said yes. The context here is that Musk used to be the world's richest man. He's still very rich, though he lost that title last week to the luxury goods tycoon Bernard Arnault. He bought Twitter back in October for $44 billion. He arrived, you may remember, carrying a sink with the words, "Let that sink in," and really we've gone on from there. Let's speak to Michelle Fleury, who's live with us on this. Michelle, he said he was going to honour this poll, so presumably this goes ahead. Okay, Michelle, thank you very much indeed. Plenty of uncertainty ongoing at Twitter. Let's quickly look at the celebrations that went on late into the night in Buenos Aires. You'll know the reason why. It was after Argentina won that incredible World Cup final. This was the focal point in the city, the famous obelisk right in the centre of town. At one point, an estimated 2 million people were in and around the area. As you can imagine, the mood was different in Paris. Here's the defeated French team arriving home a few minutes ago at Charles de Gaulle Airport. You can see them there, led by the man who scored 3 goals in the final, Kylian Mbappe, but it wasn't enough to win them the trophy, as you'll know. They lost out on penalties. Here's the BBC's Hugh Schofield. And that ends this hour of Outside Source. Thanks for watching. Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. This is BBC News. The committee investigating the Washington Capitol riot recommends bringing criminal charges against Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin's arrived in Minsk for talks with President Lukashenko as fears grow that Belarus may be used to launch a new attack on Ukraine. A peace deal with nature, the biggest UN biodiversity conference in a decade, agrees to protect a third of nature around the world. Nearly 60% of Twitter users vote for the company chief Elon Musk to step down in a poll that he posted himself. And we'll continue to look at Argentina's celebration of their spectacular World Cup victory. Well, let's begin with this developing story in Washington, where the final hearings have been taking place in DC into the January the 6th riots. That's when a mob of protesters stormed the Capitol building to try and overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And within the last few minutes, the committee has voted unanimously to recommend criminal referrals of Donald Trump over the events of that day. The US House of Representatives Committee has recommended that federal prosecutors bring 4 criminal charges against Donald Trump. These are obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the US, conspiracy to make a false statement, and a charge of inciting, assisting, aiding, or comforting an insurrection. It'll now be up to the Department of Justice to consider these charges. Well, straight to our correspondent in Washington, Nomir Iqbal. And Nomir, as I was watching that, I'm thinking, can you help us at all to understand how likely it might be the DOJ will take action and how long it might take to decide whether to? Nomir, thanks for taking us through that. That's invaluable. There's Nomir Iqbal live with us from Washington. Now, prior today, there have been 10 hearings looking into what happened on January the 6th. Let's run through some of the key moments. We know that more than 1,000 witness interviews were conducted, including several people within Trump's orbit, such as his daughter Ivanka and the former Attorney General Bill Barr. Over 1 million documents were reviewed, as well as hundreds of hours of video. The first hearing was held in the summer last year. This was how it opened. Well, one of the main topics that was being investigated was President Donald Trump's efforts to pressurize state officials to overturn the election result. The focus was on battleground states, in particular Arizona and Georgia. President Biden won Very small margins in both, in Arizona by 0.4%, in Georgia by 0.3%. Central to this part of the investigation was a recording of a call that Trump made to Georgia's top election official. This is some of it. I want to speak now to Joe Moreno, a former federal prosecutor and FBI consultant who's been following the developments in Washington. Sir, thanks for joining us on the BBC. What's your response to these criminal referrals? Joe Moreno, thanks for your time. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, President Putin is in Belarus for talks with his ally Alexander Lukashenko. There's speculation he may be there to try and organise an attack on Kiev from Belarus, just as he did 10 months ago. Now, when Putin arrived in Minsk, as you can see, he was greeted on the runway by Lukashenko. A spokesperson for Mr. Putin called any suggestion that pressure was being put on Belarus to join the war in some way as stupid and groundless speculation. And this is what Lukashenko had to say. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, Russia has launched further drone strikes, again targeting key infrastructure in and around Kiev. The Ukrainian Air Force says it shot down 30 drones, but these Russian attacks continue to target Ukraine's power grid. They have for weeks now been causing sweeping blackouts. Here are some residents in Kiev describing what happened this time. Now next, let's talk about a major development for the world's environment, because after talks that went late into the night, an agreement has been reached aimed at protecting the planet's ecosystems. Here's the reaction of the World Wildlife Fund. Well, let's look at what's been agreed in more detail. Countries have pledged $200 billion towards supporting biodiversity. Part of that involves protecting 30% of the land and oceans by 2030. As well as setting targets to prevent the extinction of species and providing funding to safeguard biodiversity for low-income countries. Here's Mike Gunton from the BBC's Natural History Unit. Now, not for the first time and certainly not the last, let's talk about Twitter and Elon Musk. Mr. Musk launched a Twitter poll asking if he should resign and appoint a different CEO of the social media platform. 57% of people said, yes, that would be a good idea. Now, Musk used to be the world's richest man. He's still very rich, but last week he lost that title to the luxury goods tycoon Bernard Arnault. Bear in mind, he bought Twitter not so long ago, back in October, for $44 billion. He arrived carrying a sink with the words, "Let that sink in," and, well, we've been doing just that ever since. When he took over, he tweeted that the bird is freed, but as you may know, it's been hugely controversial ever since. Just under half its staff were fired as soon as he took over. The remaining staff were warned of extremely hardcore working hours, and they were given 24 hours to choose whether to stay. And he ruffled more feathers by lifting bans on Kanye West and Donald Trump before announcing a ban amnesty on all banned accounts. So it's been a roller coaster. Now, celebrations went on until late into the night in Buenos Aires after Argentina's amazing World Cup victory. That's the famous obelisk right in the centre of Buenos Aires. At one point, it's estimated 2 million people were in and around that area. So the tournament has definitely been a unifying force for Argentinians. As you can imagine, the mood was quite different in Paris. Here's the defeated French team arriving home a few minutes ago at Charles de Gaulle Airport. The man leading them down the steps, Mbappe, he got a hat-trick, but he still didn't win the final, as you'll know. But he'll have more chances. He's only 23. He's already scored, I think, 12 World Cup goals, and he'll feature in some World Cups to come. That is it for this edition of the programme. Thank you very much indeed for watching. As ever, there's much more in the stories we cover through the BBC News app, and we'll be back at the usual time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Hello there. We've got a transition to milder weather conditions taking place in Europe at the moment. As